In the beginning of studying the analysis of short stories, we addressed the idea in feminist analysis, there are four key terms that we would use, whether we're analyzing society through sociological perspectives or whether we're looking at a particular story in literature analysis. These four terms are gender, oppression, inequality, and patriarchy, or a patriarchal system. These are the four concepts that we are looking for when we're analyzing a story to understand, number one, the questions that we want to ask ourselves is, what are the roles and responsibility of the individual because they are defined as masculine or feminine? What roles do they assume, or what behaviors do they assume because of their gender? Number two, we look at the idea of oppression, the idea of an individual or a group that faces inequality. And oppression is not just that the inequality exists, it's understanding where it comes from. So this can be based on, as it says here, judgment of abilities, beliefs, roles, and systems. So oppression is when we don't allow someone to believe that they can fulfill certain tasks because of their abilities, their beliefs, or roles, or systems. So we might place judgment on people as to whether or not they can attain a higher education, whether or not they're smart enough, if it comes to athletic abilities, all of these things that we make judgments, and that's the oppression that is placed on an individual, is the belief system as to whether or not they are capable of accomplishing those tasks. Inequality is stemming from the idea that there is an imbalance, or that there is an individual or group of people that have access to resources that others do not. And we often look at this in terms of money and resources. When you look at issues in society, there's an inequality for those who don't have as much money as the wealthy. So if you're wealthy, you have access to a large number of resources. So I was just thinking the other day of the government giving money to support families during COVID. And I'm not talking about the curb payments, but rather the student, if you're staying at home, and they've recently released one for high school students. So here's the challenge, is that in order to get to that, in order to apply for that, you need to have a bank account. You need to have internet. You need to have access to a device in order to fill out that application. And while I may take those things for granted, it is an unfair belief that everyone has access to those processes. And so as a person with a job that provides me with benefits and all of the things that I need in order to pay my bills, I am able to very easily apply for that money from the government. However, if you come from a position where it's unequal, that you do not have enough money to have internet connection, that you do not have a device or a computer, that you do not have the money to have a bank account, whatever it may be, whatever the problem is, that is what inequality is that it creates an imbalance, that some people are able to access the resources because they have something over the other people. Last but not least, we often refer to society as patriarchal. There are actually matriarchal societies, which is that women sustain all of the power within that system. In our society, in Canadian society, in North American society, it has typically been patriarchal, where men have had power and privilege, and that can take the place of position in government, and therefore they have the ability to make and take away access to resources for certain individuals. So we can look at that through the lens of looking at, not that we're trying to male bash in any way, shape, or form, but typically it's about who has power, right? That's what a patriarchal society is, or in a patriarchy, it's about who has power. So in a matriarchal society, it would be the women who have the power because they have the position in which to take government or have the authority to make decisions. I know that in indigenous communities, that often bloodlines travel through the women, and therefore women, as people who can bear children, often hold the power within certain groups and certain societies. So what does this all mean? What this means is that when we read a story, we are going to read it looking for all of the symbols and the images and all of the literary devices that we have been using in order to make meaning of a text that we did in Spaces Between Stars. However, from this perspective, we're going to shift that a little bit. These are the areas that we're going to be looking for. We're looking for gender roles. We're looking for where there is oppression. We're looking for inequality between individuals or groups. And we're looking at the systems or belief of male dominance and power holding and how that exists within the text that we are reading. In addition to looking at the idea of oppression and inequality within society, the other part of feminist theory within literature is that we are looking at how women are represented. So we are looking at the idea of female authors, female representation, meaning how women are presented within that text, and we're also looking for female stereotyping. And the idea of stereotyping the roles or identities of women actually led to something called the Bechdel test or Bechdel test. And so what this test is, and you can actually Google it to look it up, and there's actually websites that have analyzed modern movies in order to understand the representation of women within these movies. So one part is that we are looking for the representation of women, but we're looking at how they are represented. And so we are looking at the idea of stereotypical or negative portrayals of women in particular. And so we're looking at how women are presented, how they work with other characters, or what their position of power is within the story. So in movies, the test is by a popular means of determining how equitable a movie is. To pass this test, a movie must meet the following requirement. It has to have at least 2 named women in it who talk to each other about something other than a man. And so it's looking at female protagonists and the roles that they play or what they bring to the story, and whether or not the author is stereotyping them or how they are represented within that piece. Not that we're going to be applying this test and the requirements of this test to literature, but it's simply understanding that feminist theory isn't just about looking for oppression. That's one part of it. The second part is that we're looking at how women are represented within this story. So a sidebar. When I had my first child, it was 2008, and at this time, the idea of Disney princesses and even brat dolls were starting to emerge. And it wasn't necessarily just the marketing of it, because that was in full force. You couldn't buy anything without it possibly having Disney princesses on it. And I remember fighting so hard against it for a number of reasons, which I'll talk about in just a second. So I tried so hard to make sure that Disney princess stuff and merchandise did not end up in our house, but it slowly crept in, and it was in play sets, it was in domino sets, it was games like Guess Who, it was a number of different products that would come into the house. I had pencils, erasers, not that my child was particularly into the Disney princesses, but it is a stereotype that little girls look up to these dolls and want to be like them. So there's where we are, is that idolization of these particular figures as stereotypes of women. And so we can look at some of these stories and say, are these characters women that we want our young girls to be looking up to. So first we have Ariel, who gives away her voice so that she can have a chance to be with Eric. We have Jasmine, who is being set into an arranged marriage and is not wanting to be a part of that. Jasmine was one of the first characters to fight against that, but inevitably it is about finding her own love and her own choices, which is an interesting stand on a cultural perspective. We have Snow White, who was the most beautiful. That's really most of what she had to offer. And so she ran away to be taken care of by the seven dwarfs and the evil queen, who wanted to get rid of her because she was the most beautiful and therefore gave her a poison apple. So two women who hate each other simply because of beauty. And last but not least, Belle, who for the most part loved to read, was educated, didn't want to be like the other women who were just looking to get married. She wanted much more than that. But when we look at these characters in the Disney princess, the big question is what's the message that we're sending to children about the roles of women, or what are we showing them? Sidebar from that is that really, ultimately, this is minute compared to what we actually show children. So if children grow up in a home with a mother, number one, that can shape and influence their perspective. If they have a mother who chose to be or was in the necessity of staying at home and taking care of the household, they often grow up with understanding women's roles and responsibilities. It's interesting how that's shaping because statistics are showing that more women are working. So what that is showing young people is the necessity of women working. But what's interesting is the power dynamics within the household, as well as what jobs that mother has in particular. That is much more influential than sometimes analyzing the influence of the Disney princesses on my young child. However, what we can say is that these Disney princesses often represent ideas within society and how women are represented and how they're shown. We need to show people that there is maybe an alternative narrative to what they may know and understand in their own lives. So, how do we take these ideas and how do we look at text from this perspective? At the end of the slideshow, which I will attach in Google Classroom, are questions that after you have read and looked for those literary devices, paying attention to the lead and all of the development of the characters and their interactions with one another, these are questions that you should be asking for yourself after you read it the first time to look for meaning. What's the meaning of the work? Then we want to look at it from a feminist perspective. And these are questions that may help you on that journey to pick out the elements that we want to analyze. So how is oppression or barriers presented? Do the female characters show signs of resistance? Do they try and push back against that oppression? If so, how? Are these concerns unique to women in this time and place, or does it translate over a period of time? So when you're looking through the story, I will also attach these questions in Google Classroom, because after reading and annotating, I want you to answer these questions. These are the questions that we're going to use in discussion in period 4 today. So we're looking at roles of women, focus on the female characters, examples of oppression, what are the women or what is the character afraid of, and what could that represent? Identify the theme of the story, and does that change from the first time we read it to when we analyze it with literary theory attached to it? If this was written in the 1950s, would it change our viewpoint? And last but not least, in this story, there are many different types of water, and I'm sorry you can't see that. There's many different types of water in the story, and what do you think the transition between the different types of water represents? Is there something in those transitions as well that we need to pay attention to? So these questions will be in classroom for you to analyze for the discussion.